Hello everyone, and thanks for joining me again for this latest video tutorial. This was probably my most ambitious project to date. Are you ready for the rolling river? Okay then, let's begin. I started with an A3 board of extruded polystyrene as usual. And then I marked out where I wanted the hill to go. And to cut the foam for the hill, I used the 3-inch knife by the hot wire foam factory. The key here is to let the blade do the cutting. You don't need any force applied. Just beware that the blade is quite thin, and I use a sawing motion up and down to ensure a nice clean cut. And I carried on cutting pieces of foam following a similar contour pattern. This meant I could build up a staggered hillside. I use every bit of foam available to me, even these offcuts, which I cut in two, so that I could continue making layers for the hill. Any bits that were left over I put in a pile in the corner of my shed because they always come in useful at some point. To glue the pieces of foam together, I used Foam Fusion by the Hot Wire Foam Factory. This creates a very strong bond between the pieces of polystyrene, but it can still be cut with the hot wire tools. And to hold the pieces in place while the glue dried, I used some cocktail sticks. And then it was a case of gluing the hill onto the baseboard. And again, I pushed through cocktail sticks to hold it in place. You can either remove these later or just snap the tops off like I did. And then I went back to the hot knife to carve the hill slope. And to avoid putting too much pressure on the blade, I employed the same sawing technique as before. I just carried on carving chunks out of the hillside until I was happy with the general shape of things. It only had to be rough because I was going to be landscaping things further with Sculptamold. I mixed this as usual into a fairly stiff paste. And then just slathered it on all over the hillside. For the rocky outcroppings, I decided to use bark. This is good quality landscaping bark from a home improvement store. And of course it comes in a massive bag, so there's never really any danger of you running out in your entire lifetime. I just pressed it into the still drying Sculptamold and then used further Sculptamold to blend it into the hillside. To protect the foam base from the resin I'd be using later on, which heats up quite dramatically during curing, I decided to apply a good layer of Sculptamold over the base surface as well. And I smoothed this out as it dried using my finger. If it gets too dry, you can always wet your fingers. And then I decided to press in some more bark into what would be the riverbed before the Sculptamold had had a chance to completely dry. And I carried on working it with my fingers until I was happy with the smoothness of the surface. White gesso is good for painting over the bark rocks. It has an ever so slightly textured surface that allows paint washes to cling very nicely. And I ended up sealing the river base with it, as well as some bounce by the hot wire foam factory. This is a rubberized foam coating, and it's good for sealing little gaps, especially along the edge of the river. And then it was time to give the hill an undercoat of burnt umber. I was careful to avoid the rocks, or at least I thought I was, see later. And then I went over the wet paint with a mixture of grout and dried soil sieved through a stocking. And dusted it away from the surface of the rocks. Which was when I realised that I'd painted over one of my rocks and applied soil and grout over the top of it. Oh well, I thought, never mind, and I started painting the rocks with a wash of mid-grey and light brown. And luckily I managed to somewhat rescue the situation. Then I went around the edges of the rocks with more of the soil and grout mixture, gave it a good spray with isopropyl alcohol, which is a wetting agent and allows the scenic glue to soak through. And when the whole thing was dry, I gave it a quick brush to get rid of a lot of the surface dust. Turns out the wet paint alone wasn't strong enough to hold all of the soil and grout in place in areas. But I thought, meh, whatever, because it would be covered in static grass and other scenic materials anyway. And the first step of this process was to apply neat Mod Podge where I wanted the static grass to go. And for this piece I used Wildgrass Beige 6mm static grass by Knock. It just goes into the hopper of the static grass applicator. And then you turn the thing on, place your grounding pin and shake it over the surface of the model, about 2 or 3 centimeters away. Again, there's no point in wasting nice materials, so I turned the model over and gave it a knock on the back. And then collected up the excess, which is always a surprising amount, and put it back in the pot. And then it was time to blend in that static grass with some shorter lengths. When I say lengths, you could use several different lengths. In this case, I only used 2mm static grass by Pico. This is an autumn mix. And once I'd collected up the excess from this round of static grass, it was time to brush the static grass lightly with a wide brush to make sure it's pointing in the right direction up the slope, and then go in with some fine turf by Woodland Scenics. This is their burnt grass and earth varieties. Final adjustments to the rocks can be done at this stage. I'm just using a very light wash of acrylic ink to lend some shadows, and then a very light dry brushing with some off-white. I often think the fancier you go with rocks, the more unrealistic they look. You can dry brush them to highlight every single detail and they can end up looking quite naff. I applied the same very simple process to the riverbed rocks. For the riverbed colour itself, I used a combination of greens and a yellow. A dark green first to lend the sense of depth. And this gets applied over the entire river. Before I went in and highlighted shallower areas of the river with a lighter green. And quite frankly, you can ignore this step because I wasn't quite sure how I was going to texture the river base, so I decided to stipple it with a sponge. And anyway, I went over the entire river again with a very light wash of black acrylic ink. This looks very dark at the moment, but it does dry a lot lighter. And I just blotted it off the shallower areas of the river and then went over those areas again with a bit of yellow and ended up with this. As moss, I used Fine Turf by Woodland Scenics. This is their green blend. And I also used some of their earth blend. You never know how much of this is going to end up covered up, but it's worth doing because you want what isn't covered up to look as good as possible. And because I'd be applying scenic glue over the entire model, I decided to detail the hillside using ground up fern leaves and different shades of Woodland Scenics Coarse turf. These just get sprinkled over the static grass and in the gaps between the static grass, pressed in, teased out with a finger, placed between rocks as low-lying bushes, given a thorough soaking with isopropyl alcohol, and then an even more thorough coating with scenic glue, which is 3 parts water to 1 part matte medium. And to make sure that the bushes were firmly held down, I even went over them with a pipette filled with scenic glue. I realised I wanted more stones on my riverbank, so I used some slate from my garden path. Since these would be underwater, it was okay that they were a slightly different colour from the other stones. And for the smaller stones along the riverbank, I sieved some small stones from some sharp sand, and I just mixed in a couple of shades of green, giving it a thorough mix to make sure every stone was coated. And I applied these over the riverbed straight from the pot. Because the paint was still wet, they did need teasing out a little bit. But there seemed little point in letting them dry separately when I could just apply them over the bed and let them dry overnight. And I shaded these with a bit more fine turf. Where I wanted the river to appear deeper, I used some black acrylic ink, which soaked into the fine turf. Now, I'm afraid I really don't know what these are. It's kind of like a slightly damp, mossy substance, or perhaps like damp bark. I did buy it from a hobby shop. Anyway, once all of that was down, it was time for another go with the isopropyl alcohol and scenic glue. For the resin dam, I just used masking tape. It's just important to make sure that it's pulled taut. And sealed along the bottom edge with some white glue, This is wood glue. The resin I used for this project was epoxy resin, and it required a 60-40 mix of resin to hardener. Make sure your empty cup is on the scales when you zero them, otherwise you'll get your measurements wrong. And then it's just a case of mixing the resin and the hardener into the same cup, which is good because it saves on plastic cups. Just go very carefully, otherwise you'll overshoot your measurements. A gram or two here and there isn't going to hurt. And then you can mix it in very, very slowly to avoid introducing too many bubbles into the resin. Epoxy can be tinted with standard acrylic paint. I went with a green and I just mixed it in very small amounts at a time. You can always add more, but you can't take it out, and you don't want to lose the transparency of the resin. In fact, I ended up using another shade of green as well. This was a darker green, and again, just a spot on the end of a cocktail stick, and then mix it in thoroughly. I actually mixed this for about 5 minutes. Some people find this bit a bit scary. I don't, I love it. It's so satisfying to see the glass-like resin pour all over your carefully prepared riverbed, bringing it to life, adding nuances of light and colour, and adding a sense of depth that up till now you would scarcely have believed was possible. I pushed the wet resin around with the lolly stick into all the nooks and crannies. And then passed a soldering torch over the surface to burst all the bubbles that appear after about 20 minutes. And 24 hours later it was time to remove the masking tape. Always a joyous occasion, except for the lip that the resin leaves, which you can remove with a sharp blade. And now for my absolute favourite part, adding ripples. For this I used Mod Podge, and I applied a reasonably thick layer over a part of the river at a time, and pushed it around by blowing through a straw into really realistic ripples. And because this was quite a thick layer, I made sure to really blast it. And here's what it should look like after you've done that process. And here's what it looks like after it's dried. Beautiful. But this wasn't going to be a gentle stream, it was going to be a torrent, so I used some Fix-All crystal clear polymer by Soodle, cut with a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, and mixed thoroughly together. And started sculpting the rapids. This stuff is a perfect solution for this kind of modelling because it dries fairly quickly, but not so quickly that you can't sculpt it as you're going. You just need to keep pushing it into the shapes you want with your lolly stick. Making sure to pay attention to where it flows around the rocks. And also to the fact that water never just flows in a jumbled mess. It tends to pile up and form patterns. Look at some photos if you're not sure. And to blend in the rapids into the Mod Podge, I used some brushstroke Mod Podge, which is a thicker version of the gloss. It dries completely clear, but it retains its shape. Don't go too thickly or it will remain cloudy for quite some time. Just make sure you're following the flow of the river, especially again where it flows around the rocks and leads away from them. This will take a bit longer than standard Mod Podge to dry, about 3 or 4 hours. And when it is dry, it's time to create white water. And for this I used 2 products by Vallejo, Ground Texture Snow, which is a thick textured paste that can be used to simulate froth and foam, and can also be stippled lightly and dry brushed over the edges of waves. And then snow and foam water texture, which is a very thick acrylic, and it dries very quickly, and I tend to use a cocktail stick to stipple it on like a pointless technique. For a more detailed look at this, you can see the video on my Patreon page. I used some more of the snow texture to build up froth along the riverbanks. You can really pile this up. As you can see, this is all a fairly lengthy process as I carry on blending the white water into the river. And this included dry brushing some white acrylic paint over the ripples. Because I'd used quite a lot of matte paint, I decided to go over the white water with some Mod Podge gloss. This just lent the froth that watery look. And once again I blew it around with a straw. And then after looking at some photos, I realised that fast running rivers churn up the riverbed, so I needed to add some browns touched with a bit of yellow to make a kind of beige tone, which I could very lightly stipple between the rapids, ensuring to leave some of the green showing through, but also ensuring to go over some of the edges of the white water, just to take away some of the starkness of it. And then I went over the crest of the rapids again with some more snow and foam paste using a cocktail stick and the pointless technique. This final step just drew the whole piece together. And then it was time to start on the trees, and I wanted a weeping willow, so I used some jute twine, which I untwisted into its individual strands. Until I had a fan of strands. Which I then gave a spray with Art and Craft adhesive, aka spray glue, and a thorough coating with knock leaves. Then the whole thing was sealed with matte clear sealer. And we had a rather nice fall of leaves. This is one of my wire armature trees, and I just sprayed it with some more of the adhesive, making sure as far as possible to avoid the trunk. And then I just pressed each fan onto the end of the branches, teasing them out as I went along. And not worrying too much if any leaves fell off. I mean, this just adds to the texture of the foliage, right? And speaking of texture, I used some polyfiber with knock leaves in a similar fashion to how I'd used the twine, and just applied this also. This lent the tree some body without losing any of its delicacy. Because of the root structure of the tree, all it needed to stand up on the model was a good squidge of tacky glue, and then pressing firmly into place, bending the roots as necessary to fit the contours of the land. I made further trees using twigs and reeds and weeds and knock leaves and polyfiber and sea foam. I've got a couple of other videos that can help you with those. and they just got placed in the land by boring a small hole with a pin vise and then putting in a bit of tacky glue and carefully slotting the tree into place. To bulk up my little forest, I adapted some cheap trees from the internet, and again I have a Patreon tutorial on these. But by far my favourite kind of ready-made-ish trees are seafoam trees, which I detail more fully in Making a Scene Volume 3. And there we have it, my rolling river. Thank you for sticking with me through this epic build. I had a ton of fun making it. I think ultimately this is the most satisfying project I've undertaken, and the end results are probably my best. That's what I love about doing this, the constant striving for improvement. I'd like to take this opportunity to say a big thank you to the people who have supported me on Patreon. If you'd like to support the channel and get some cool rewards to boot, please visit my page. Thanks a lot. Cheerio.